Aretha Franklin pointed at the guitar and said, "No effects tonight." Jimi Hendrix unplugged the cable, picked up the guitar, and the first note he played made Aretha speechless. Detroit. Late November 1968. A small apartment on the west side. 12 people. Most of them sitting on the floor. A few on the worn couch. Someone had brought wine. Someone else had brought cigarettes. The kind of gathering that happened after the real show. After the stage lights went down, after the crowds dispersed, after the masks came off. Aretha Franklin was there. Not the Aretha from the album covers or the concert halls. Just Aretha. Tired from 3 weeks on the road. Wearing a simple dress. Hair pulled back. Sitting in the armchair by the window. Jimi Hendrix was there too. Quiet in the corner. He'd played a show in Detroit 2 nights before. Stayed because someone told him there was a session happening. He'd shown up with his Stratocaster. Nothing else. No roadies. No entourage. Just him and the guitar. They'd been talking for an hour. Music mostly. The state of radio. What was happening in Memphis? Someone had put on a Smokey Robinson record. Someone else was arguing about Otis Redding's last recordings. Then Aretha looked at Jimi. "You gonna play something?" Jimi glanced at his guitar leaning against the wall. "Maybe." "Without all that," Aretha said, gesturing vaguely toward where his pedals would normally be. "Just you. Just the guitar. No effects. No amplifier tricks. Nothing between you and the sound." The room went quiet. It wasn't a request. It was a test. Everyone knew what Aretha was really asking. Can you play? Really play? Or is it all the equipment doing the work? Jimi didn't answer immediately. He stood slowly, walked to his guitar, picked it up. He looked at the cable running to the small amplifier someone had set up in the corner. Then he did something no one expected. He unplugged it. Completely. The guitar was now just wood and strings. No electricity. No effects. No distortion. No wah-wah. No fuzz. Nothing but acoustic resonance in a small room. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Jimi sat down on the floor. Cross-legged. The Stratocaster resting across his lap. He looked at Aretha. She looked back. Either of them smiled. "What do you want to hear?" Jimi asked. "Surprise me," Aretha said. Jimi's fingers found the strings. Not the high notes. Not the flashy runs everyone expected from him. He started low. Simple. A blues progression so old nobody remembered who wrote it first. 3 chords. The kind of thing a kid learns in his first week with a guitar. But the way Jimi played it. The room leaned in. His fingers barely moved. No theatrics. No showmanship. Just pressure on strings. The unplugged Stratocaster producing a sound so quiet people had to hold their breath to hear it. But in that quietness was everything. Every bend. Every tiny variation in pressure. Every ghost note that lived in the space between the notes. Someone sitting near the door started to say something. The person next to them touched their arm. "Don't." Jimi's eyes were closed. His head tilted slightly. He wasn't performing. He was listening. Following something only he could hear. The guitar became an extension of thought, not an instrument being played but a voice speaking in a language older than words. Aretha's expression changed. The test she'd set up, the challenge meant to expose limitations, was turning into something else entirely. Because what Jimi was playing wasn't technical mastery. It was truth. Raw. Unfiltered. The kind of playing that can't hide behind volume or effects or showmanship. Every hesitation meant something. Every silence meant something. The spaces between notes carried as much weight as the notes themselves. A woman sitting on the couch, a session singer whose name nobody would remember but whose voice had been on a dozen hit records, put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled. Jimi moved into a second phrase. Still quiet. Still simple. But now there was a melody emerging. Something that sounded like it had always existed. Like he wasn't composing it but uncovering it. Brushing dirt off something ancient. The 12 people in that room were no longer in Detroit. They were somewhere else. Somewhere without time. Without context. Just sound and space and the human need to express what can't be said with words. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He stopped. Complete silence. His fingers lifted from the strings. The last note faded into nothing. For 5 full seconds, an eternity in a room full of people, nobody moved. Then Jimmy looked at Aretha. "Your turn," he said. Aretha blinked. "What? You asked if I could play without effects? Now I want to hear you sing without the studio. Without the microphone. Without the reverb. Just you." The room held its breath. Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, the voice that had moved millions, the woman who could fill any hall with power and precision, looked genuinely uncertain for the first time that night. "I don't," she started. "You don't need to plan it," Jimmy said quietly. "Just sing what you're feeling. Right now." Like I just played what I was feeling. Someone in the corner understood what was happening. This wasn't a competition. This was communion. Jimmy had stripped away his armor. Now he was asking Aretha to strip away hers. Aretha's hands were gripping the armrests of her chair. Her knuckles had gone white. The test she'd given Jimmy had somehow reversed. Now she was the one being asked to be vulnerable. To perform without protection. To let these 12 people, some of them strangers, see her completely naked musically. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she sang. No warm-up. No preparation. Just a single note. Sustained. Pure. Then a phrase from a hymn her grandmother used to sing. Nothing from her albums. Nothing anyone in that room would recognize. Just something that lived in her bones. Her voice filled the small apartment the way Jimmy's guitar had, not with volume but with presence. Every tiny variation. Every breath. Every place where her voice cracked slightly, and she didn't hide it. She sang like nobody was listening. Like she was alone in a church at dawn. Jimmy's fingers found the strings again. He didn't interrupt. He found spaces. He played between her phrases. Supporting. Never competing. His unplugged guitar creating a foundation so subtle most people wouldn't notice it was there. But without it, Aretha's voice would have been alone. With it, she was held. They went back and forth like that. Voice and guitar. Neither one leading. Neither one following. Just 2 people having a conversation in a language deeper than words. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. The session singer on the couch was crying openly now. A young guitarist who'd come to the gathering hoping to network was sitting perfectly still, his own guitar forgotten beside him, his face showing the expression of someone watching their understanding of music fundamentally change. When it ended, and nobody could say exactly when it ended, just that at some point there were no more notes. The silence in the room was different than the silence that had come before. It was full. Complete. Aretha opened her eyes. She looked at Jimmy. He looked back. And something passed between them that the other 10 people could feel but couldn't name. "Okay," Aretha said quietly. She was smiling but there were tears on her cheeks. "Okay. Okay," Jimmy repeated. One person started to clap but stopped immediately. Applause felt wrong. This hadn't been a performance. It had been something else. Something that didn't have a category. The gathering continued for another hour. People talked. Someone put another record on. Wine got poured. But the energy had shifted. Everyone in that room had witnessed something that would become impossible to describe to people who hadn't been there. Years later, decades later, each of those 12 people would try to explain it to others. Music journalists would hunt down the story. Some would claim it never happened. Some would say it was exaggerated. But everyone who had been in that room knew the truth. They'd seen two masters strip away everything between themselves and their art. And in doing so, they'd reminded everyone watching what music was actually for. Not showmanship. Not commercial success. Not proving anything to anyone. Connection. Truth. Vulnerability as strength. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. The young guitarist who'd been sitting on the floor left music entirely within a year. Not because he felt defeated. Because he realized he'd been playing for the wrong reasons. 20 years later he became a music teacher. He never told his students about that night directly. But everything he taught came from what he learned in those 20 minutes. The session singer changed how she approached every recording after that. Producers noticed. They couldn't identify what was different. Just that something had depth now that hadn't been there before. She never explained where it came from. Aretha and Jimi never performed together publicly. They moved in different worlds. Different genres. Different audiences. But people who knew them both, really knew them, said they'd occasionally reference Detroit in conversations. Just that. Detroit. And the other person would nod. Years after Jimi died, a journalist asked Aretha about him. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He played the guitar like he was apologizing. Like every note was him saying sorry for being so honest." The journalist didn't understand. Aretha didn't explain further. The guitar Jimi used that night, the unplugged Stratocaster, stayed with him until his death. After he was gone, the estate tried to auction it. But the listing was withdrawn. No explanation given publicly. Privately, someone close to the estate said Aretha had called. Said that guitar needed to be in a museum. That it had done something important. It sits now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Next to the placard describing its use in various performances, there's a small note, added years later. Played unplugged in Detroit, November 1968, at a private gathering. Witnesses report it was the quietest performance of Hendrix's career. And the one nobody could forget. In that small apartment on the west side of Detroit, the building is still there, though nobody lives in that specific unit anymore. 12 people learned something that night that changed how they understood mastery. Real power doesn't announce itself. Real skill doesn't need effects. Real connection happens in the spaces between the notes. Hendrix never needed to prove anything. He just needed to play. And in playing, really playing, stripped down to nothing but fingers and strings, he showed everyone in that room what they'd been missing. The effects were never the point. The volume was never the point. The technical wizardry everyone associated with his name was never the point. The point was always this. One human being, completely honest, creating sound that made other human beings remember what it felt like to be alive. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. That night in Detroit, Aretha tested Jimi. But the real test wasn't whether he could play without effects. The real test was whether anyone in that room, including Aretha herself, could handle that much honesty. They could. Barely. And they were never the same after. The apartment owner, a man named Marcus who worked at Motown's warehouse during the day and hosted musicians at night, kept that night a secret for 40 years. He never told reporters. Never sold the story. When he finally mentioned it in a small interview for a local Detroit history project in 2008, he was 73 years old. "People asked me if I recorded it," Marcus said in that interview, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't. Some moments aren't supposed to be captured. They're supposed to be lived. And then they're supposed to change you. And then you're supposed to carry that change with you until you can pass it on to someone who needs it." The interviewer pressed, "But don't you wish others could hear what you heard?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that became the closing quote of that oral history project. "If you heard it, you wouldn't understand it anyway." Not really. Because what happened that night wasn't about the notes Jimi played or the notes Aretha sang. It was about 12 people in a room remembering that music isn't something you perform. It's something you confess. He died 3 months after that interview. His daughter found a notebook in his belongings. Inside, on the first page, written in fading ink, November 1968. Jimi played. Aretha sang. I learned what silence sounds like when it's full. No other pages had writing. Just that one line. The rest of the notebook was blank. As if that single moment was worth more than anything else he could have written in a lifetime. In 2015, a music historian tracking down legends about Jimi Hendrix's quieter moments managed to locate 8 of the original 12 people who'd been in that Detroit apartment. 3 had died. 1 refused to talk. But the other 8, now in their 60s and 70s, all confirmed the same details with eerie consistency. The unplugged guitar. Aretha's challenge. The hymn nobody recognized. The way silence felt heavy afterward. The young guitarist who quit. The session singer who changed. And most importantly, the feeling that they'd witnessed something that couldn't be replicated even if someone tried. You can't recreate honesty, one of them said. You can only be there when it happens. Somewhere in Detroit, in a small apartment on the west side that's now divided into 2 studios, the walls still remember. The floor where Jimi sat cross-legged still exists. The window Aretha sat beside was replaced in 1987, but the frame is original. And sometimes, according to the current tenant, a music student who knows nothing about what happened there, late at night when the city is quiet, the room has a quality to it. A fullness in the silence. Like the space itself learned something that night and never forgot.